Close your eyes and imagine a landscape of wild marshes and 7 jagged hills. There are no marble temples here, no paved roads, no grand statues. There is only a small, muddy settlement overlooking a bend in the Tiber River. It's a place populated by outcasts, fugitives, and shepherds looking for a fresh start. To the rest of the world, this tiny village is nothing. It's a speck on the map of Italy, surrounded by powerful neighbors who could crush it in a heartbeat. But this humble patch of earth is about to become the center of the universe. This is the birth of Rome. The story of Rome doesn't begin with a crown, but with a betrayal. Legend tells us of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned to the elements and left to die. Saved by a she-wolf and raised by a shepherd, they grew up with hearts as wild as the wilderness itself. But when it came time to build their own city, the bond of brotherhood wasn't enough to hold them together. On the Palatine Hill, a dispute over the city's boundaries turned deadly. Romulus, fueled by a divine ambition, struck his brother down. Blood was spilled into the very soil where the foundations of the city were laid. It was a dark omen of what Rome would become, a power that would value its own survival above all else, even family. In these early years, Rome was a sinkhole for the Mediterranean. It offered sanctuary to the homeless and the exiled, creating a population of hardened men with nothing to lose. They were surrounded by the sophisticated Etruscans to the north and the fierce tribes of the mountains to the east. Rome was the underdog, fighting for every inch of land. Every harvest was a battle. Every winter was a gamble. They weren't kings yet. They were survivors. But they had something their neighbors didn't: an obsession with order and a relentless, stubborn will to endure. They organized their chaos into a military and their survival instinct into a government. They transitioned from a fragile monarchy into a republic, a system where the people, or at least the powerful few, had a voice. But as the city grew, so did the shadows on its horizon. To the south, across the sea, a rival power was watching. A power that didn't just want to compete with Rome, but to erase it from the face of the earth. The young city had survived its neighbors, but it was about to face its first true test of fire. The year is 218 BC, and the Mediterranean is not a Roman lake. It is a battlefield. Rome had survived its childhood, but now it was an adolescent power, and it was about to run headfirst into a titan. Across the water in North Africa sat Carthage, a shimmering, wealthy, and ancient empire that viewed the rising Rome as nothing more than a nuisance of dirty peasants. But these peasants had something the wealthy Carthaginians didn't: an unbreakable spine. The struggle between these two powers, known as the Punic Wars, would decide the fate of Western civilization. It wasn't just a war for land. It was a war for the soul of the world. And for a long time, it looked like Rome was going to lose. Enter Hannibal Barca. He wasn't just a general. He was Rome's living nightmare. Hannibal did the impossible. He led a massive army, complete with war elephants, across the frozen, treacherous peaks of the Alps. He descended into Italy like a lightning bolt, crushing Roman legions with a brilliance the world had never seen. At the Battle of Cannae, in a single afternoon, over 50,000 Romans were slaughtered. The soil of the Italian peninsula was soaked red. In the streets of Rome, there was total panic. Mothers wept for sons who would never return. The Senate sat in stunned silence. Hannibal was at the gates. This was the moment where any other nation would have surrendered. Any other people would have begged for mercy. But the Romans were different. In their darkest hour, they didn't talk about peace. They banned the word peace from the city. They lowered the minimum age for military service. They even freed slaves and put swords in their hands. They refused to admit they were beaten. This Roman way, this sheer, stubborn refusal to die, is what truly birthed the empire. They realized that to survive, they couldn't just defend their walls. They had to strike at the heart of the enemy. While Hannibal ravaged their countryside, Rome sent a young, brilliant general named Scipio to the shores of Africa. They took the fight to Carthage's doorstep. The final showdown at the Battle of Zama changed everything. When the dust settled, the mighty Carthage was broken. Rome didn't just win, they erased their rival. They burned the city to the ground and, as legend says, salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. Rome was no longer a small city-state fighting for survival. It was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But as the riches of the world began to flow into the city, the old ways of the Republic began to crack. The soldiers were returning home, but they weren't finding the same Rome they left behind. A new, more dangerous hunger was beginning to grow. They say that gold is more dangerous than iron. After the destruction of Carthage, Rome was no longer a city of simple farmers and stoic soldiers. It was the center of a vast, growing web of wealth. Treasure ships arrived daily, filled with silver, silk, and slaves. But this new wealth acted like a poison. While the generals and senators grew obscenely rich, the common people, the ones who had bled for Rome, were losing their land and their livelihoods. The Republic, once built on the idea of shared power, was beginning to rot from the inside. The streets of Rome became a theater of political assassinations, riots, and greed. The system was breaking. It was a machine designed to run a city, but it was now trying to run the world. And in this chaos, the people stopped looking to the Senate for leadership. They began looking for a savior, a man of action. Enter Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar wasn't just a politician. He was a visionary with a sword. He took his legions into the wild, untamed forests of Gaul, modern-day France, and for 8 years he waged a campaign of brutal brilliance. And he didn't just conquer territory, he built a legend. His soldiers didn't fight for the Senate anymore. They fought for him. They loved him. They would follow him into the mouth of hell if he asked. Back in Rome, the Senate was trembling. They saw Caesar not as a hero, but as a monster in the making. They ordered him to give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, to face trial and ruin. They wanted to strip him of his power and put him back in his place. But Caesar knew that in Rome there was no middle ground. You were either the hammer or the anvil. On a cold January night in 49 BC, Caesar stood on the banks of a small, shallow river called the Rubicon. To cross it with an army was an act of high treason. It was a declaration of civil war. There would be no turning back, no apologies, no second chances. He looked at the dark water, turned to his men, and uttered the words that would echo through history. The die is cast. He plunged his horse into the stream. With that single splash, the Roman Republic breathed its last breath. Caesar marched on Rome, not as a conqueror of foreign lands, but as a master of his own people. He swept away the old, bickering politicians and declared himself dictator for life. He began to rebuild the city, creating grand forums and reforming the laws. He was the sun around which all of Rome revolved. But the more light a man casts, the darker his shadow becomes. In the corridors of the Senate, men were whispering. They saw a man who wanted to be a king, and Rome had hated kings for 500 years. They were sharpening their knives, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. March 15th, 44 BC. The Ides of March, a day that lives in infamy. Julius Caesar walked into the Senate house, confident and untouched, unaware that the men smiling at him held daggers beneath their robes. In a flurry of steel and betrayal, the man who had conquered the world was brought down by his own friends. 23 stab wounds ended his life, and as he fell at the base of his rival Pompey's statue, the conspirators shouted that they had saved the Republic. They thought that by killing the tyrant, they could bring back the old days of freedom and debate. They couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of peace, Rome exploded into a decade of fire and blood. The vacuum left by Caesar was too great for any committee to fill. It was a world-ending civil war that pitted brother against brother. On one side stood the assassins, claiming to fight for liberty. On the other, Caesar's loyalists, hungry for revenge. But out of the smoke emerged a figure no one expected. A sickly teenage boy named Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir. The world laughed at him. Generals like Mark Antony called him a boy who owes everything to a name. But Octavian was a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was a master of the long game. He outmaneuvered his rivals, crushed his enemies, and finally, in a massive naval battle at Actium, defeated Mark Antony and the legendary Cleopatra. When Octavian returned to Rome, he didn't call himself a dictator. He didn't wear a crown. He was too smart for that. Instead, he took the name Augustus, the revered one. He claimed he was restoring the Republic, while secretly gathering every thread of power into his own hands. This was the true beginning of the Roman Empire. Under Augustus, the chaos stopped. The borders were locked down. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, began. For the first time in generations, a merchant could travel from the sands of Egypt to the rainy hills of Britain without fearing a civil war. Rome became a city of marble. They built aqueducts that carried millions of gallons of water, roads that stretched for 50,000 miles, and monuments that still stand today. Rome had reached its golden age. It was the peak of human achievement. The empire was so vast, so rich, and so powerful that it seemed it would last forever. The Romans believed they had conquered time itself. But there is a curse that comes with absolute power. When one man holds the fate of millions in his hands, the only thing that matters is the character of that man. And as the crown passed from the wise Augustus to his successors, the bloodline began to sour. The golden era was about to be stained by the madness of the men who sat on the throne. Imagine standing in the heart of Rome at high noon in the year 117 AD. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meat, expensive oils, and the sweat of 1 million people. You are standing in the capital of the world. From here, the emperor's word travels thousands of miles in every direction. It reaches the rain-soaked forests of Britain, the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, and the misty banks of the Danube. Under the Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire has reached its absolute peak. It is a sprawling, breathing titan that covers 5 million square kilometers. It is the greatest superpower the human race has ever seen. But this wasn't just about land. It was about the Roman machine. They had perfected the art of civilization. They didn't just conquer people. They turned them into Romans. They built cities in the middle of nowhere, complete with theaters, heated baths, and running water. They built the Pantheon, a dome so perfect and massive that it still defies modern architects. They built the Colosseum, a mountain of stone where 50,000 people roared for the blood of gladiators. For nearly a century, Rome was blessed with what historians call the 5 good emperors. These weren't men who inherited the throne by birth. They were chosen for their talent and adopted by their predecessors. It was a meritocracy of giants: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and finally the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. During this era, the empire felt invincible. Trade flourished. Silk from China and spices from India flowed into Roman markets. Science, law, and philosophy reached heights that wouldn't be seen again for 1,000 years. It was a time of light, order, and seemingly endless prosperity. If you were a Roman citizen, you felt like you were part of something eternal. You felt like the gods themselves were smiling upon the eagle. But even at the height of the sun, the shadows are longest. The last of the good emperors, Marcus Aurelius, spent his final years not in a palace, but in a tent on the frozen frontier, fighting off barbarian tribes that were beginning to push against the borders. He was tired. He was sick. And for the first time in 100 years, the chain of merit was about to break. Marcus Aurelius had a son. His name was Commodus. And unlike his father, Commodus didn't care about philosophy, duty, or the Roman people. He cared about fame, blood, and himself. When the crown was placed on his head, the golden age of Rome didn't just end. It shattered. The Pax Romana was over. The long, slow, and brutal descent into the darkness was about to begin. Success is a slow poison. When the Roman Empire was fighting for its life against Hannibal, it was lean, hungry, and united. But now, at the end of the 2nd century AD, it was fat, complacent, and rotting from the head down. The transition from the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius to his son Commodus wasn't just a change of leadership. It was the moment the Roman soul began to wither. Commodus didn't want to lead. He wanted to be worshipped. He believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He spent the empire's dwindling treasury on lavish games, where he himself would enter the arena as a gladiator. While the borders were being probed by hungry Germanic tribes, and the economy began to buckle under the weight of corruption, the emperor was busy slaughtering tethered animals in the Colosseum for applause. When the inevitable happened, and Commodus was strangled in his bath by a wrestling partner, Rome didn't find peace. It found a vacuum. The year 193 AD became the year of the 5 emperors. The throne was no longer a sacred duty. It was a prize to be bought or taken by force. At one point, the Praetorian Guard, the elite bodyguards meant to protect the emperor, actually put the Roman Empire up for auction. They sold the most powerful office on earth to the highest bidder, a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus. The message was clear. Rome was for sale. This sparked a century of fire known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. For 50 years, the empire teetered on the edge of total annihilation. It was a period of barracks emperors, generals who were declared rulers by their troops, reigned for a few months or even weeks, and were then murdered by the next ambitious commander. Of the 26 men who claimed the title of emperor during this time, almost all died by the sword, the noose, or poison. But the rot wasn't just in the palaces. The Roman denarius, the silver coin that held the global economy together, was being debased. To pay for the endless civil wars, emperors mixed the silver with cheap copper. Prices skyrocketed. Hyperinflation turned life into a nightmare for the common citizen. Trade stopped. Cities began to build massive walls, not to expand their reach, but to hide behind. Plague swept through the provinces, wiping out a third of the population in some areas. And as the Roman legions were busy fighting each other for the crown, the barbarians at the gates realized the giant was bleeding. The Goths, the Vandals, and the Persians began to tear at the edges of the map. By the year 270, the Roman Empire didn't look like a superpower anymore. It looked like a dying beast. It had actually split into 3 separate pieces, with rival leaders claiming pieces of the corpse. It seemed the end had finally arrived. The light of civilization was flickering, ready to go out forever. But then a man emerged from the ranks of the army who refused to let the dream die. He was a hard, cold soldier named Diocletian, and he realized that if Rome was going to survive, it had to change so drastically that it would never be the same again. He was going to save the empire, but in doing so, he would break its heart. Imagine a house so massive that you can no longer hear the screams of someone in the next room. That was the Roman Empire by the end of the 3rd century. It had become a bureaucratic monster, a titan too heavy to stand on its own 2 legs. The Emperor Diocletian, a man of cold, hard logic, looked at the map and realized a terrifying truth. The Roman Empire was simply too big for one man to rule. His solution was radical. He didn't just change the laws, he cut the empire in half. He created the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, 2 emperors in the east and 2 in the west. It was a desperate surgical operation to save a dying patient. For a moment, it worked. The borders were stabilized, the economy was frozen in place by decree, and the chaos of the civil wars subsided. But in saving the empire, Diocletian killed its spirit. The old Roman Republic was officially dead. The emperor was no longer a first citizen. He was now a lord and master, a semi-divine figure hidden behind layers of silk and golden ritual. But the peace didn't last. As soon as Diocletian retired to his palace to grow cabbages, the 4 rulers fell upon each other like starving wolves. Out of this carnage rose one of the most transformative figures in human history, Constantine the Great. Constantine knew that the old Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo, were losing their grip on the people's hearts. On the eve of a climactic battle at the Milvian Bridge, legend says he saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." He won the battle. He won the empire. And then he did something that changed the world forever. He legalized Christianity, turning a persecuted minority into the most powerful force in the Roman world. But he didn't stop there. Constantine looked at the city of Rome, the ancient, proud, marble heart of the world, and he turned his back on it. He moved the capital of the empire 1,000 miles to the east, to a Greek city called Byzantium. He rebuilt it into a new Rome, calling it Constantinople. It was a city of gold, strategically placed to control the trade of the east. While Constantinople rose in splendor, the original Rome, the mother city, was left in the shadows. The armies were moved east. The money flowed east. The genius and the power followed the emperor. The West was left behind like an aging, forgotten parent. It was a land of crumbling roads and underpaid soldiers, guarded by a shell of its former glory. And in the dark, cold forests of the north, the barbarians were no longer just raiding, they were moving. Entire nations, men, women, children, and warriors, were fleeing from a new terror rising in the steppes of Asia. They weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for a home. And the only thing standing in their way was a Roman border that was starting to look very, very thin. For 800 years, the city of Rome had a boast. It was a boast whispered in the marble halls of the Senate and shouted by the legions on the frontiers. No foreign soldier had set foot inside the walls of the mother city since the days of the Gauls, nearly a millennium before. Rome was Urbs Aeterna, the eternal city. It was a place that simply could not fall. But in the year 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The world was changing. In the vast, frozen steppes of Central Asia, a new and terrifying force had awakened. The Huns. They were a nomadic storm of horsemen who fought with a ferocity the West had never seen. As the Huns pushed westward, they acted like a giant snowplow, driving entire nations of Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, and Franks before them. These tribes weren't just invaders. They were refugees. They showed up at the Roman borders by the hundreds of thousands, begging for land and protection. But the Roman Empire, once famous for its ability to absorb and integrate outsiders, was now too corrupt and too paranoid to handle them. They treated the refugees with cruelty and contempt, starving them and selling their children into slavery. It was a fatal mistake. You do not humiliate a people who have nothing left to lose and swords in their hands. The Goths rose up in a fury. At the Battle of Adrianople, they didn't just defeat the Roman army. They annihilated it. They even killed the Roman Emperor Valens on the field. The invincibility of the Roman legion was gone. The predator had become the prey. Leading the Goths was a man named Alaric. He had once been a soldier in the Roman army himself. He knew their tactics. He knew their weaknesses. And most importantly, he knew that the city of Rome was no longer the fortress it once was. In August of 410, Alaric and his Visigoths stood before the gates of Rome. They didn't have to storm the walls. The city was starving, its people reduced to eating grass, and some say even each other. Finally, a gate was opened from the inside, perhaps by a slave, perhaps by a traitor. The Goths poured in. For 3 days, the eternal city was stripped bare. Gold was torn from the temples, silk was ripped from the villas, and the proud descendants of Caesar were forced to watch as their history was packed into barbarian wagons. The physical damage to the city wasn't actually that great, but the psychological blow was terminal. When the news reached the rest of the empire, people couldn't believe it. St. Jerome, writing from his cell in Bethlehem, wept, saying, "The whole world has perished in one city." The illusion of Rome was dead. If the mother city could be violated, then nothing was sacred. The borders collapsed. The Vandals took North Africa and Rome's grain supply. The Franks took Gaul. The Angles and Saxons took Britain. The Roman Empire in the West was now a ghost, a collection of titles and ceremonies, with no real power behind them. The light was fading fast. All that was left was the final, pathetic whimper of a dying giant. History has a strange, almost poetic way of repeating itself. The city of Rome was founded by a man named Romulus. and in the year 476 AD, the man sitting on the throne, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, was also named Romulus, Romulus Augustulus. But where the first Romulus was a warrior who built a city out of the mud, this last Romulus was a frightened boy, a puppet caught in a storm he couldn't possibly understand. He didn't rule an empire, he ruled a ghost. The vast territories Caesar had conquered were gone. Britain was a memory. Gaul was a collection of Germanic kingdoms. North Africa was a Vandal stronghold. Even the Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now a playground for pirates and invaders. The Roman army, the legendary machine that had crushed Hannibal and conquered the world, no longer existed. In its place was a disorganized mess of federated troops, barbarian mercenaries who were paid to protect a state they didn't belong to. One of these mercenaries was a man named Odoacer. He was a Germanic chieftain who had risen through the ranks of the Roman military. He looked at the boy emperor in the palace at Ravenna and realized a simple, brutal truth. Rome didn't need an emperor anymore. The title was a lie. The authority was a myth. In September of 476, Odoacer marched into the palace. He didn't kill the young Romulus. He simply stripped him of his purple robes and sent him away into exile. It wasn't a grand cinematic battle. There was no heroic last stand. It was a quiet, pathetic end to the greatest power the world had ever known. Odoacer did something even more symbolic. He gathered the imperial crown, the scepter, and the royal robes, the insignia of the West, and sent them in a crate to the emperor in the East, in Constantinople. The message was clear. There is no longer an emperor in the West. We don't need one. It's over. With that single gesture, the Western Roman Empire, the world of the Caesars, the gladiators, and the Senate, ceased to exist. The lights of the ancient world were being extinguished, one by one. The great library of Alexandria was a ruin. The marble temples were crumbling. The roads were being reclaimed by the forest. Western Europe plunged into what historians call the Dark Ages. 1,000 years of order, law, and literacy began to dissolve into a fractured world of local warlords and constant survival. People forgot how to build the great domes. They forgot how to read the ancient scrolls. They looked at the ruins of the Colosseum and thought they were the work of giants, not men. But even as the West fell into silence, something strange was happening. In the East, the Roman flame was still burning bright in Constantinople. And in the ruins of the West, the ghost of Rome refused to stay buried. Its language, its laws, and its god were already woven into the very DNA of the people who had destroyed it. Rome was dead. But in its death, it was about to create the modern world.